Erev Tov Chavrim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live, October the 4th, 2018. And guys, before we get started in the news here, there's something, I just wanted to read an excerpt to you. Of course, we're going to be getting into Pompey calls the S-300 delivery to Syria a serious escalation. And we mentioned this kind of in the title already. But as we're getting into all of this, there is a book here that my wife was able to get a hold of, and it is written by a rabbi. In fact, it is written by Rabbi Moshe Schoenfeld, and there is a tremendous amount of evidence in this book. I'll kind of share with you guys so you can see for yourself. The name of the book, The Holocaust, Victims Accuse. And this book is loaded with facts of what happened during the war years, the Second World War, with Adolf Hitler, what happened to the Jewish people, and of course the neglect by the Zionist movement, the Jewish Congress, and the plight of literally hundreds of thousands of Jews that were killed as a result, more so at the neglect the Jewish Agency, the Jewish Congress, as well as the Zionist organization. The elite were just allowing the Jewish people to be sent to their deaths. We have actually spoken about these things before, but I thought I would share just a little excerpt with you just before we get started on the news here, because a lot of times people are just totally not aware of the truth of what really went on during the Holocaust. And I have tried to bring this out over and over and over, that the Vatican was working with elite Jews in order to create the state of Israel. There was no intention to save the Jewish people from the Holocaust, especially by the Jewish people that were the elites. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence in this book here that shows exactly what would happen. It says here on page 58, in this book, Hasatan Ve'Hanefesh, Satan and the Soul, Joel Brand publicizes excerpts of the letter that he sent to Moshe Sharit. Moshe Sharit was the foreign minister of Israel in the beginning when Ben Gurion was the prime minister. He would also become the second prime minister of Israel. He states here in his own writings here to Moshe Sharit, he states, "My heart beats with a sense of solidarity toward the party to which I dedicated the best years of my life. But this cannot and need not prevent me from determining the historical truth without taking into consideration whether some of our friends and the ruling elite will be hurt by this or not. I am convinced that in the years of 1942 to 45, there was a fateful negligence on the part of the authorized institutions. For decades, our people strove toward one end, the Zionist goal, which was again and again aspired to, the gathering of all Jews in the Jewish state. And in the days of Hitler, another goal should have taken precedence, to save the lives of our people. However, our friends continued to go in the way dictated by the old goal. Without discerning, the nation itself was dying in the interim. When 3/4 of the Jews of Central Europe had already died in the gas chambers, the Jewish populace of Hungary was still untouched, and there was a chance to save an overwhelming majority of at least this part of our nation from annihilation. However, this historical chance was missed because all the Jewish institutions, the Joint, the Jewish Agency, the Zionist administration, the Jewish parties and democratic lands, did not recognize that the rescue of Jewish lives was the central goal, and that all those goals were to be subverted to it. You, Comrade Sharit, and all the agencies did not do a single thing to alarm without delay the whole world, or to alert all the newspapers in the free world as much as possible. It is impossible to say that you did not receive information about what was occurring. Hungary was the last link in the chain. First Warsaw went. We from Budapest in the last years related to you all the details and general personal reports about the earth-shaking fate of the Jews in the areas conquered by the Nazis. We also sent witness to you that was the time you should have taken critical measures. Included in your guilt is the fact that the world was silent, because if the world had not been alarmed, the King Klausenberg, Jews would also have known that they had to flee. In all parts of the world, millions of dollars were gathered for us by the Joint and other Jewish agencies. But when it's time to use the money to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews, they started to act stingy. You know, it goes on in here, and I had brought this out in one of our news broadcasts not too long ago, that Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharit were rescued as part of the elite group by and helped to get to Israel by Pope Pius XII. But it was at the cost of 800,000 Jews. Well, I finally found the actual documentations, the very letters. This book contains all the documented facts about who did what, when, where, why, and how. Every documentation that can be traced is written in this book. And what it was during the time when the Hungarian Jews were being transported to Auschwitz, daily 12,000 were being killed, and nearly, I think it was 500,000 of them would be murdered over this space of time. 800,000 actually is what would be murdered. Ben-Gurion was being continually contacted about what was going on, and he refused to even utter a word. That was Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharit. They turned a deaf ear to the plight of these Jews. This book is filled with testimonies by Jews of the tragedies and the complicit work with the Nazis that caused the extermination of hundreds of thousands of their own people at the hands of the Nazis because of the failure of helping their own people to be rescued. It's very sad, very tragedy there. And of course, the second tragedy is that this book is not allowed to be in print. We paid nearly $100 to be able to get a hold of this book here so that we could find out what the truth was and what's really going on in the world. But we're going to be sharing this book with you guys. Probably on Patreon is where we'll actually try to share the entire book there over a course of time. And because the world needs to know. You need to know what really went on. And, you know, in one point, Hitler was trying to send an entire load of the Jews to Israel, and they were all sent back. Tells you in there who sent them back. Because it was a boatload of elderly, infirmed. They didn't want them. The truth is going to come out. Let's get into what's going on. Pompeo calls S-300 delivery to Syria a serious escalation. And it is very interesting as I've watched some of the articles that are coming out right here that Israel and the United States are getting ready to try to figure out how to overcome the S-300 system. They are definitely looking at using the F-22 to do this, but the question is going to be as to whether or not the F-22 and the F-16, there's this particular model of the F-16, can actually outmaneuver the S-300 system. In my opinion, what it looks like is that they're planning to try to launch an attack on the S-300 system inside of Syria to be able to destroy this system. And I can see that being something that could very much realistically happen. It says here, October 3rd, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told reporters during a press conference that the delivery of the S-300 long-range air defense system to Syria is a serious escalation. According to the Jerusalem Post, Pompeo's statement is the first official response from the U.S. on the matter. A day earlier, the Minister of Defense in Russia announced that several S-300 systems were delivered to Syria along with other military equipment in order to ensure the safety of Russian servicemen in the country. The decision to supply Syria with this advanced system was taken after the downing of the Russian Il-20 intelligence plane off Syria's coast last month. And again, I have to say, I have stated here many times, I believe that Israel has every right in the world to defend themselves. But with that being stated, does not Syria also have a right to defend itself? Now, I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to make this appear as if he's not targeting the Syrian government. In fact, he's targeting the Iranians that are inside of the country. But the Iranians have not been targeting Israel. They have been targeting the terrorist organizations that are being supported by the U.S., Turkey, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and a host of other countries in the region. I am definitely not one for here to say that Iran is some great saintly nation by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, at the same token, we have to understand Syria has a right to defend itself. Russia making this decision to give them the S-300 system, and it's not like they've given them 20 or 30 of these units here, but they've given them some of these units in order to protect them own selves from the threat of being shot down by mistaken identity. So Russia in this regard should have a right to defend themselves as well. But it's odd. I watch this over and over and over on the world stage and the media there, and the U.S. is always able to defend themselves. Israel can defend themselves, but all the rest of you countries, you're not allowed to have your own defense. That really makes no sense, does it? And in fact, if you really wanted to look at the whole situation in Syria, this war could have ended long ago. Not by saying Iran, Hamas, get out. Actually, if you'd have got Hezbollah, if you get Iran and Hezbollah out of the country, which I don't like either group, by the way, then it probably would have been that the NATO forces would have overthrown the Syrian government much sooner. Is that what the translation of this is supposed to mean? Or if Russia had minded its own business and left, you would have certainly crushed Assad into the ground with ISIS. Again, there's no right for self-defense. Very sad, very sad. Jerusalem, the S-300, top Israeli official has said that Iran's military presence in Syria would still be vulnerable even after Russia provides Damascus with its more advanced S-300 air defense system. We have made it clear to the Russians at the highest level in recent days that we have no interest in confronting Russia or Syria. Israeli Regional Cooperation Minister Sahaki Hangabi was quoted as saying by the Israeli Broadcast Authority, the more the Syrians understand that our efforts are not directed against them, the better for all concerned. That's kind of hard for the Syrian people to believe, guys. I mean, listen, love your neighbor as yourself, Moses said, and this is certainly something we're not doing. And and we're kind of like double speaking, because at one point Israel had agreed that as long as the Iranians were, I think it was 100 kilometers from their border, they would be okay with that. Now it doesn't matter where they are in the country. Everywhere is a problem. And where do you draw the line on this? It's really ridiculous. This Russian says here, we hope that Israel colleagues will behave rationally in terms of actions in the Middle East. We proceed from the fact that the fight against terrorism is necessary, but at the same time, Syria should not turn into an arena of settling accounts, Deputy Foreign Minister Vershini stated recently there with the country of Russia there. And then we also have this article came out as well in Sputnik. U.S. may scramble the F-22 fighters in response to the S-300 missile in Syria. It says on Tuesday, Russia announced the delivery of the batteries of the S-300 anti-aircraft missile systems to Syria. The U.S. Air Force may employ the F-22 stealth fighters and F-16 CJ Vipers to suppress and destroy enemy air defenses in response to Russia's deployment of the S-300 air-to-air missile system to Syria's government, the Drive wrote. The U.S. already used the F-22 and the F-16 CJs during the opening stages of its military campaign in Syria, when it was not yet clear how the Syrian government's forces might respond to their appearance in the country's airspace. Washington may have to return to such tactics, though it already continues to employ F-22s in the area near Syria, government control, the magazine wrote. Moscow announced that last week that it would supply the S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to Syria after government forces responded to an Israeli strike on September 17, mistakenly shot down the Russian military reconnaissance plane, killing all 15 crew members. Now, is this going to end up turning into a situation where the next thing you know, then Russia's going to give them the S-400 system? You know, India's looking at getting the S-400. Turkey's looking at getting the S-400. Well, then why not Syria? You know, it's like there's never an end in what's going to happen next. Yeah, at this point here, Russia is causing it to where Israel cannot just fly the normal F-16 into the airspace without having a major risk in being shot down. And I would imagine the next thing we might find is Israel firing Scud missiles or some, not Scud missiles, but the Tomahawks from one of their submarines in on Syria as the next course of action to limit the risk of having their own pilots shot down. Or will Israel end up taking a chance to see if they can outmaneuver the system? You have to remember, Israel did take, and they were part of the war games to see how to outmaneuver the S-300 system that was delivered, that was over in Greece with war games with NATO not too long ago. So to me, it seems like that they have anticipated this move of the S-300 system in the region there. A UN court, turning to other news here, a UN court orders Washington to lift Iran sanctions linked to the humanitarian goods on on humanitarian goods, which that kind of fell on deaf ears, as we know. The U.S. president has talked about totally leaving these different groups because of not agreeing with the things that are being stated. But you know, this has been something that's been in accordance with American law from the very beginning, and we know the Syrians have felt the same issue as well when it comes to life-saving drugs, things like that. They just cannot get it. When those sanctions are in place, you're not getting it from the U.S. Doesn't matter. In other words, there is no humanitarian needs that will be met unless it's for the terrorists that are in the nation to try to overthrow it. You know, I just see so much hypocrisy, and it's just very sad. Sad to see that. It's interesting how Daesh and U.S. forces are so close to each other. This is from Sputnik here. It says Iran says Monday missile attack launched in Syria killed 40 Daesh leaders. 7 drones and 6 ballistic missiles were used during the strike in the Abu Kamal region of eastern Syria. According to state media, Tehran conducted the strike on terrorists who it says were responsible for a recent terrorist attack in the Iranian city of Ahvaz. Sputnik was discussed Iran's missile attack in Syria with Fouad Azadi, professor of political communications at the University of Tehran. It says, in your opinion, how successful was Tehran in this show of force in Syria? Mr. Azadi stated here, I think the long-term success basically depends on whether this was effective enough to make sure that these terrorist organizations would not engage in terrorism in Iran in the future. Iran is relatively a safe country. We had this terrorist attack in Habaz. A couple of years ago, there was a terrorist attack in Tehran, and then in Tehran, that attack 2 years ago was the first attack in 30 years. So in the last years, we've had 2 terrorist attacks on Tehran, which is actually a better situation when we compare this to what is happening in Paris and London and some other European capitals. So Iran is relatively safe from these types of attacks, and the people in Iran are not used to terrorism, basically. And the government's aim by these missile launches is to make sure that enough pain is delivered to the terrorist organizations so they don't engage in this type of activity. Based on what the Iranian government has announced and based on what the U.S. has announced, it seems that the U.S. missiles have found their target. The U.S. military announced yesterday that the missiles had landed 5 kilometers away from U.S. forces in Syria, which basically is a sign that the missiles reached their destination. The question you might have is that how come ISIS and the U.S. forces are so close to each other? And apparently they're not engaging in any type of confrontation. You know, this has been things we've been seeing going on in Syria from day one. All types of reports of U.S. forces moving Daesh fighters in and out of their places. giving them safe passage. Even after Aleppo, they allowed a huge long convoy of ISIS fighters to leave, not Aleppo, but Raqqa. Allowed them to leave Raqqa and go over into Iraq. It's just a bit odd. And yet at the same time, we keep hearing President Trump say, well, we've done more to defeat ISIS than any of those nations over there. Maybe it should have been we've done more to arm ISIS than any of those nations over there. Maybe that's what really should have been said, and that's just not being the case. Also, 11 dead as a U.S. transport crashes in Afghanistan. Taliban claims credit for shooting down an American, looks like a C-130 there, over in Afghanistan. That's something that Western media has been pretty quiet about. I know they've reported about this plane going down, but they've not really talked about it very much. So the White House would prefer to sweep under the proverbial rug this incident here, where their C-130 aircraft, a war of words quickly ensued, with the Taliban claiming a successful shoot-down, while the U.S. denied any altercation, claiming it was just an accident. At any rate, though, there were 11 people on board that were killed, some of those being U.S. forces, some of those are not U.S. forces, and there is some dispute as to who actually was on board this plane. I don't know the answers to that, but I think it's just worth mentioning here. Another one here as well on this article right here. We have no way of addressing this. Ex-NSA scientists react to China sneaking microchips in DoD servers. That's an interesting one. Says an explosive Bloomberg report revealed that China was superstitiously inserting small microchips into servers that later ended up being used by the Department of Defense, CIA, and many large American companies. And ex-NSA scientists warned there was no way of addressing this risk from a strategic standpoint. We can find a couple of them, but we're not going to find the next generation version, said Dave Attell, a former computer scientist for the National Security Agency, now working as a chief security technical officer of Cytera. That makes it very hard to trust computers in general. You know what it reminds me of is that what a lot of people are not aware of, in a lot of our military aircraft, there's a lot of Chinese software that's in those planes there. So if we ever went to war with China, could you imagine just how easy it would be for the Chinese just to, whoop, we would disappear? Our planes would just start falling out of the skies. You know, it makes you wonder about who you should allow to be part of your military technology. Kind of in closing here, I do want to share something with you guys here. And this here is one reason why I read at the very beginning of the broadcast, this book here, The Holocaust Victims Accused. Netanyahu is likely to extend secrecy of some 1948 war documents 20 more years. Defense establishment asked to lengthen the classification period to 90 years from 70 for a material on Deir Yassin massacre, among other events. They want to keep these things suppressed so that nobody really knows what happened. And I will tell you one thing. As I have been reading this book and nearly just about finished with it now, it reminds me of the book Yam Suf that I wrote when I wrote about the Bielski family and how that he had rescued 1,200 Jews, and he did not care if they were elderly or if they were sick. He did not do as this political elite that were rescued out of the Holocaust by the Vatican, and there's some very dirty hands of bishops and cardinals that were involved in this operation as well, by the way. But, you know, Bielski never cared that they were poor or indifferent or that they were elderly. He rescued any person that was Jewish that he could because he cared about the humanity of his own people. And he kept them in the woods, moving them about from place to place. And even when he went to Israel in 1948, he refused to take part in the 48 war because he was being asked to kill his own people that were to try to dare even think about liberating Jerusalem. Well, that was because Pope Pius XII, one of the contingent agreements was that Jerusalem would be left for the Vatican and not to be overthrown by the Israelis. And they agreed to do that. Moshe Sharit Ben Gurion both agreed to do that. So this book here is like unbelievable documentation about the things I've been sharing with you, things that were brought out by people like Barry Chamish, Joel Boehnerman, and others that have warned how that there is an elite class in Israel that has been working with the Vatican all along for a new world order. And that's what you find out when you realize how many Jews died as a result of not per se Adolf Hitler, but more as a result of the neglect of these elite Jews that did not want these people coming to the state of Israel. It will shock you. Be joining us on Patreon next week because we'll be sharing some of the excerpts from this book. I'm going to really get into this, but I'm also going to cross-references is what we're going to do. We're going to, as we bring these things out on Patreon, we will cross-reference the information that has been publicized in here so that you can see the facts from both sides. I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. Erev Tov.